Good morning, everyone. It's certainly my sincere pleasure to welcome everyone here today and to host this international panel on a subject of great interest to all of us, and that is digital identity in an increasingly data-driven economy. So I'm Namir Anani, President and CEO of the Information and Communications Technology Council. To set this discussion into context, I think it's fair to say that digital IDs have come into the forefront of the debate recently as a result of the accelerated digital adoption, given the pandemic environment and the recent event, but also the fact that we have moved almost overnight into a contact-free economy and digital-led in a sense. The way that we started to transact with our economy, whether it's through e-commerce, e-banking, e-learning, and many other fronts has accelerated in a considerable manner. But if we look at, in simplistic terms and define what is digital identity, in essence, it's an aggregated information in a digital format about an individual, an organization, or a smart device that provides better authentication of information, so it avoids multi-touch points and administrative burdens. And it's heralded to accelerate business growth from scale and scope, but also help economies and help individuals as citizens and consumers to interact with the economy and the society. So it increases and improves the way that we interact with the health system, with the banking, increased democratic participation, and political inclusion, and the list goes on. But with all those interesting facets that digital identities provide, there are a lot of questions that come with it. And they range from, well, how will this information be governed? Will it be between the private industry, between the government? What is the interplay that will be happening into that? How do we increase trust in this environment? What technologies and biometrics will be used? Will I have, as an individual, control of this information? And the list goes on. So today is a rare opportunity for us to dialogue with subject matter experts on this issue, but also have a deeper dive and start to exchange and look for some of the solution space. So how will this panel play out is that I will be initially introducing the panelists just by name and title, because there's enough information on them on the web. After that, I will be asking each one of them to provide a 5-minute their perspective on the matter to help shape some of the discussions afterwards. And then I will start with questions and answers, and we'll ask them to ask potentially questions of each other and intervene at any time. The last 10 to 15 minutes we'll dedicate it to the audience. So please start preparing your questions as we go through the discussion. And I look forward to a very engaging and fast-moving discussion on a subject of great interest to all of us. So with that in mind, let me start with presenting the panelists today. So the first panelist is Johnny Brennan, is the president of the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada. Second is Christine Keown, is the chief data officer for the city of San Jose, obviously Silicon Valley, and the 2020-2021 Harvard Business School Leadership Fellow. Last but not least is Miquel Estepe, who's the Deputy CEO and Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer of Open Government of Catalonia, obviously from the beautiful region of Catalan in northern Spain. So I'm delighted to have the panelists here on this subject. And maybe, Johnny, we'll start with you. So I'll hand it over to you for the first 5 minutes, and then we can move to the rest and we start the discussions. Johnny, all over. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here with this panel of really fantastic guests, and to present this work with ICTC as well. So as mentioned, I'm president of an organization called the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada. We are a nonprofit organization. We're about 105 or so members, and we focus solely on digital identity and how we can solve digital identity that empowers people, protects privacy, and grows the economy. And while we're at it, and so this is the single issue that we focus on. We don't promote any specific technologies, and our role really is to provide a neutral forum and analysis of how different technologies might work together, how standards might work together, what policy may be necessary. And so when we talk about this topic around digital identity, I would like the audience to really think about kind of business processes, legal processes, technology processes, and kind of how all of those fit together to contextualize what we're talking about. And so we're not only talking about a technology solution, we're talking about how people work with these solutions and how policy is bound to them. When we think about digital identity as well, I'd like the audience to think about the notion of how we prove who we are when others ask us in order to perform some kind of transaction. Really think about that as a foundation. And so solving the ability for us to prove who we are when necessary, there are many other types of functions that can be attached to that can enable. And so as we go through the conversation today, we might be talking about things like proving your COVID passport, quote, quote, your COVID vaccination credential, for example. Have you been vaccinated? And so in our view, when we talk about something like, how do you prove that you've been vaccinated where necessary, we look at that as identity at the center, because we need to know, is that vaccine actually attached to you? Do we know who you are? Can we confirm that? But also, how do we do that with privacy, that you're not presenting more information that's necessary? And then from a societal perspective, how does that happen in a way that's inclusive and doesn't kind of pull anyone out of societal opportunities, which is incredibly paramount to this work. So if we think about identity as kind of being an enabler, whether we're talking about managing our health data about us, whether we're talking about banking and managing financial data, all kinds of data about us, identity really sits at the root, at the foundation of those kinds of abilities to transact. On the other side of that, identity is also paramount for if you put yourself into the role as a patient. Well, this identity approach, this digital identity, is important for you as well, for you to know that your practitioner really are who they claim to be, that they have the right certifications. For that practitioner to authenticate to a system and to be able to access records. And so everywhere we look, whether we're on the side in the healthcare use case, whether we're a patient or whether we're a practitioner or a facility or a laboratory, there are digital identity verifications that are required in order to access data in these ecosystems. And so really what we're focusing on is that foundation of how do we prove who we are, no matter what kind of role we're playing, and then also how can organizations prove who they are as well, so that we know that we're transacting with an organization? So this is really foundational to kind of everything that we do in our digital lives, which are inseparable, I think, more and more these days from our physical lives. And so this is something that we need to work together on. And so when we think about that kind of ecosystem that I was talking about, we have to think about as well that there is no single entity that is prepared, that is able to solve all of these challenges. And so really, when we're talking about moving forward from solution perspective and what that looks like, we should think that there will be many kinds of solutions. We should think that governments have a very important role to play here. You, as a person, as a user, have a very important role to play here. As well as many private sector organizations in the economy have important roles to play here. And so really a collaborative approach that works for you in a 360-degree kind of view, collaboration is required here. So we do need to have a very collaborative space. And when we think about digital identity as well, we want to think about something that's very important here that I think often gets overlooked around this space is we also need the enabling policy. And so there's been a lot of work in Canada and around the world on policy enablement. And for those of us in Canada, you may be familiar with Bill C-11 from a federal government perspective, which is about implementing Canada's digital charter. And so we need to look at what kind of policy changes are required, not only for data about you that's in the private sector, but also for data about you that's in the public sector. And so if we think about some of the most useful data that's held about us is in the public sector. And so if we think about how many times when you in your life have you been asked to show your government issued ID? Now, a government issued card is technically, legally not an identity card. But often your driver's license is used as a proof of identity, or your passport is used as a proof of identity. A driver's license has been issued to you for the purpose of driving, to validate that you can drive. A passport is issued to you to verify that you have the ability to travel. But in reality, in the world, these are used as identity verification documents very often. So how do we bring that policy into perspective with the way that these kinds of documents and credentials are being used further than the purpose that they were intended for? And that's okay, because this is something that we all do and we all understand. So the trick here is, how do we put access to that kind of data, that kind of verified data, into people's hands and enable them to use it, but doing so in a way that, both from a technical, business, legal, and technical perspective, doesn't create a surveillance ecosystem. This is not about surveillance. This is about empowerment. So we have to work together to ensure that it's not about surveillance. And then at the same time, Namir talked a bit in the intro about emerging models. For example, one emerging model is the model that he mentioned, self-sovereign identity, which is more about kind of putting people very much in control with data that's verified about themselves. And so as we move from through the ecosystem of where we are now, from a business, legal, and technical perspective, to more empowering ecosystems, we also have to understand what kind of responsibility people will be required to manage for themselves when they are in control of these kinds of data. And so there is going to need to be education, and we're going to need to have clear rules of the road as to where and how we should use that data. What does good data usage look like to protect ourselves and in order to get done what we need to get done? And also, if something does go wrong, with that data that we use, how are we protected? What is the expectation that we should have there? If you think about, and quite often this kind of new data ecosystem and this empowering ecosystem, you could think about it almost as networks. You could think about it as networks for verified information sharing, where you're more in control. And so if you think about it, kind of a network that we're all familiar with, or many of us are familiar with, such as a credit card network, you do have very clear rules as to what is your liability when you're using that credit card. How are you protected? How are the merchants protected when that credit card is being used? And so we having the right rules of the road, both in terms of especially in terms of kind of privacy and security, are managed, but also, what does liability look like? What does accountability look like in these kinds of ecosystems as they get more empowering, but potentially also more complex as we move forward? And then I think the last point that I'll leave with, that I would like the audience to think about as we go through the conversation here, is that we've done some research. We do quite a lot of research at DIACC to actually try to gauge Canadians' perspectives on these topics, on digital identity, on data and privacy and empowerment. And one of the things that came clear through in our most recent survey, and particularly with COVID, was that 8 out of 10 Canadians who were surveyed coast to coast to coast, if they were propositioned that with the scenario that, hey, if we could move you to digital, if you would move to digital, if you'd be comfortable to move to digital transactions with government, with banks, with your place of work and otherwise, and if moving you to digital meant that the rest of the population who was not prepared to move to digital would actually get better service through the phone and better accessibility, would you be willing to move to digital? And 8 out of 10 were overwhelmingly willing to say, look, if I would move to digital, and I would especially move to digital if I knew that people who couldn't use digital would get even better help and more access than they have today, because those channels will be more open. And I don't know about you, but I do remember in the first early days of COVID when so many phone lines were just clogged. Nobody knew what was happening. Even the Zoom line you couldn't get through on. So this is also about load balancing. And so when we think about as we go forward, think about it less of a flip of a switch and more of a gradient, and starting to move people who are ready and not leaving anyone behind, and providing more support through traditional channels to those who need it. And so this isn't a digital only, this is a digital move with more inclusion for those who can't go through these digital channels. Thanks so much, and I look forward to this conversation.
Perfect, thank you, Johnny. It raises a lot of questions for me, and I think that's the purpose of setting the stage. Christine, the floor is all yours.
Joni did a great job just providing the overview of the landscape, and I'm really appreciative that she kind of ended at the point of service delivery, because I think a unique perspective I bring to this group is someone who has been delivering kind of key services during since the beginning of the pandemic. Actually, prior to joining the city of San Jose, I was at the U.S. Small Business Administration, working as a data scientist on the Paycheck Protection Program. This was the emergency relief program for small businesses. As as the U.S. economy was was struggling back in March of last year, and the verification process, the entire process from awareness to application to receiving the funds, and now actually to be forgiven for this forgivable loan has been so manual that it just provides such a great case study for why digital IDs are actually necessary to enable transaction. I think I actually like talking about it in terms of the small business community, because the small business community, at least in the United States, is extremely diverse, right? It can mean everything from a 3-person accounting firm to actually folks like my parents who run a restaurant with 7 tables. And so I think even even kind of that heterogeneity amongst small business communities it's a really good reflection of both the benefits and also struggles if the U.S. government, right, at the federal or even local level ever rolls out a digital verification process, because there is inconsistency when it comes to access to the English language. There is inconsistency when it comes to access to digital, right? Having kind of the mobile capabilities to meet the standards, right, around verification, right? And I think there's sometimes even kind of a gap in literacy when it comes to even the services that verification would enable you to access, right? Like there is heterogeneity, and I want to flag that because it's so much more than just a technology issue, right? I think we're actually in this really interesting place in the United States where the pandemic has certainly, I think, accelerated the roadmap for states to even consider it. I'd say currently right now in the US, I believe only 3 states have rolled out some kind of digital ID infrastructure. I think it's Delaware, Oklahoma, and Arizona. But I think more and more states are actually starting to consider it for the first time, because service delivery in a remote setting during a global pandemic was so painful. Painful for residents, and also painful for for government operators. And I think one of the most interesting kind of news from even just a couple weeks ago was Apple announced at the Worldwide Developer Conference that they're interested in introducing driver's license, or at least U.S. state driver's licenses, into their ecosystem. And so I feel like the technology is kind of it's definitely on our side when it comes to digital IDs, but I do worry about the implementation. And I think that goes to kind of Joni's point about making sure that the policy around is inclusive, making sure the policy rollout and implementation is equitable, and that it doesn't create a situation where folks who are able to easily kind of participate in this kind of ecosystem ends up receiving services disproportionately better than the folks who have already traditionally been left behind. And so I think that context is really important. And I think the only other thing I'd like to talk about, and then it's a good segue to Mikhail, is a more international lens, right? I think I had presented a very kind of US centric look, and the US is quite unique. It's kind of a federation of privacy laws. There are a lot of complexities. Even in the city of San Jose, the city has a separate privacy law than the library, than the police, the state of California, and the state of California's privacy laws are actually quite different from even the national one, right? And so I think I wanted to kind of even in that one sentence demonstrate why it's so difficult to even roll out something like this because of all the different levels and variants in our privacy policy. I have worked for the State Department before, and when I was working for the State Department, I was stationed out in China. And so I've also had the opportunity to live in a country where digital IDs are actually quite standard, and the rollout of it actually does include a lot of biometrics far beyond kind of what Delaware, Oklahoma, and Arizona has considered. And I think that's actually a good segue to think about, how countries with certain types of privacy laws can still learn, right, from countries who are different from us. But maybe I think there really is an opportunity to look to other countries to consider best practices and also try to learn from them as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Christine. That really sets the stage and a good segue for an international looking, how Europe is looking at this dimension. So, Mikhail, the floor is yours, and we'd love to hear from you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Namir and ICT, for the invitation to participate in this great panel. And I'm delighted to be here with you. And I hope that you are all fine. I work in government. I'm based in Barcelona, in Spain. I am a civil servant, and I work in driving the digital transformation and fostering public innovation. Actually, I've been working in implementing and providing digital identity services during the last 15 years. So we have been providing user and passwords, digital certificates, two-factor authentication mechanisms based on mobile, and now we are exploring these the self-sovereign identity solutions. Before starting, I would like to say that the views and the points that I will share are my own, and I'm not talking on behalf of any government or organization. So let's go to the point. Digital identity is not about technology, as all the previous speakers have said. It's about having access to digital rights, but it's much more actually. It's about having access to rights, to social rights. We live more and more in a digital world where many key services are only accessible through internet. And we have seen this during the pandemic. The only way to access to many public and private services during the pandemic has been using an electronic channel. So digital identity is the means that gives access to health records, to education, to apply for social benefits, to get government documents that are essential on some private services. For instance, in Spain, you have to request a government document for asking to postpone a mortgage payment. So having a digital ID means digital inclusion and social inclusion. And it right now it's and as it's been said, is a critical issue. So let me share some insights about the challenges, the risks, and the issues that we are facing. On average, a person manages about 70 different accounts in banks, e-commerce, social networks, and government. That is highly costly and insecure, and every day is getting worse. And at the same time, we are having far too many cyber attacks. So basically, we are right now at high risk. So the traditional digital identity mechanisms based on user password are dead, actually, and are extremely vulnerable. So we have to move to new solutions, like Johnny said before. And according to our data, in average, a citizen just makes 3 transactions with all governments per year, only 3 transactions per government. So they seldom use their electronic ID on public services. And therefore, if, for instance, we provide a user password, what will happen is that they will not remember it when they want to use it. And that's a security issue. But on the other hand, citizens use some of these 70 digital identity on a daily basis in some killer applications from the private sector, like social networks, banking, and e-commerce. So here, there's a big difference between what is happening in the public sector and what is happening in the private sector. Right now, what is happening with citizens when they do transactions with government is that they are struggling with their digital identities. So, and let me give you some indicators. For instance, during the pandemic, we delivered a social service program in Catalonia for 100,000 citizens. And we have some different channels to manage all these transactions and to submit all the forms. But 15% of them, 15,000 people, couldn't get a standard digital identity through the standard channels, neither online nor on site. And on the other side, what our data says that more than 50% of citizens that initiate a government transaction do not finish it. And we conduct citizen surveys, and the main reason is that they are struggling with the digital identity. And just one indicator more. If you give the option to request to enroll a digital identity from home or an on-site office, 99% of citizens prefer to do it from home. So these are some of the issues we are having right now, and we have to try to solve in the future. And I believe that the current model is very efficient. Each federal government, state or region government or private company has their own digital identity, and this is extremely inefficient, as I said. But what's funny is that in other areas we have managed to agree about providing some universal services in different type of interactions. For instance, we have paper ID passports that are accepted worldwide. We, as somebody said before, we use credit cards which are universal, and we can pay taxes and private goods. Or for instance, we use the email technology to communicate with everywhere and by everybody. So the big challenge from my point of view is why we do not have a universal and standard digital ID for both local and international organizations, for both the public and the private sector, and also for all the people, wealthy people, and also the people with social demands.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michael, for setting the stage again for the discussion. Maybe, Johnny, I'll start with you with the first question. I think it's clear from a lot of research. McKinsey research came out recently saying that digital ID will unlock between 3 to 13% of economic benefits to GDP by 2030. And that depending on where the country is around the world and their adoption of digital IDs. You mentioned the question, or you raised the issue of policy and cooperation that has to play, but maybe if you can expand on what type of interplay has to be done between government, private industry to unleash digital IDs and get the economy to embrace this in a much more coherent and rapid manner.
Yeah, thanks. It's fascinating as Miguel was talking and he talked about the 70 accounts. I use a password manager and I looked at my accounts and I have 356 right now. So wow. This is a big problem. What do we need in terms of the collaboration? Well, I think, and I'll also, make the disclaimer that I'm speaking from my own perspective and not on behalf of the Canadian government or even necessarily all of our members at DIACC. But one of the things that I see is that perhaps perhaps even more important than technology is the policy making that has to be done. And so if we look at, for example, in Canada and Canada's digital charter and the federal Bill C-11, the federal Bill C-11 talks more about what Canadians' expectations should be about data that's held about them by private sector entities. And what we don't have, which is important, of course, but what we don't have as well is a ride-along policy or a matching policy from a federal perspective as to what Canadians' expectations should be regarding federal data that is held about them. And so, for example, a passport would be a piece of federally held data in Canada. Your tax information would be examples of federally held data in Canada. If you're an immigrant like myself, your immigration record, your Canadian birth certificate, your permanent resident card is an example of federally held data. And so what I'm talking about in terms of policy is more about how can you access that as data, and how can you use that as data. We get a card or a paper passport, or we can log into the Canadian tax agency, but we don't have access to that data in an interoperable format that we can then take it and use it. And there's no clear policy that says that the government must give us that data, what the terms of that are, and how we can and should use it. And so what I often kind of observe is you sort of have some in the public sector that are very, very open to empowerment and basically we don't have a rule that says we can't do it, so let's do it. And then on the other side, you have those that are very, very conservative and concerned that say, well, we don't have policies that says that we can give this, so maybe we shouldn't because we don't fully understand the terms, and if we lose people's trust, that we can't rebuild that. So you kind of have in both scenarios, you have very well-intended policymakers, and because of this gap in policy, we're kind of looking at each other and not sure what to do and how to go forward to empower people. So that kind of enabling policy with data at the federal level is needed. Which also goes through inclusivity, equability, ensuring that no one is left behind there. And setting accountability and liability in that space as well. And when you look at that from a policy perspective in Canada from a federal level, it is very challenging because, our federal government operates as different ministries. And so there is no single department at the federal government in Canada that is responsible for this file. They all have kind of pieces of it. And so how do we kind of bring how is a cohesive strategy developed, recognizing that, Transport Canada has its role and Industry Canada has its role. And so bringing a cohesive view across the different federal departments for policy that enables in this way at the federal level is really important. The second part of that is that much of this data that we're kind of talking about in Canada as a federation is actually under the authorities of the provinces. And so it's not a matter of simply the federal government stepping forward and solving this and building infrastructure. That doesn't match to who and how we are. And so we also need very similar kind of policy work that's done in the provinces, using a COVID vaccination credential as an example. That COVID vaccination credential is really held within the provincial healthcare authorities. And so how that's issued and who can access it and who can develop it, that happens at the provincial level. So we need that collaboration and cooperation among the different federal departments from a federal data perspective. And then we need something very similar and with the same kind of authority for the data that's held by the provincial authorities as well. So that's the layer of complexity on the policy. I think there actually is quite a lot already of policy with regard to what the private sector can and can't do or shouldn't do. So there's been a lot of work there, but we haven't seen quite that work yet on the public sector side, although I think we're starting to see that now. So again, not technology. It's all about access to data and rules of the road around access to data.
Great, thank you, Johnny. I mean, it's definitely a complex and nascent domain that we have to reflect on. What are the right policies to make that happen? Actually, Christine, maybe it would be a good segue to discuss that. So as Johnny mentioned earlier, we have to strike the balance between unlocking economic benefits, but also ensuring inclusion in a digital future, and potentially getting more people on digital IDs may open up more avenues for service delivery for those that want to use telephone, fax, or whatever the traditional means or of doing that. But can you expand on, from your experience, which countries have done a better role in that? What are the right approaches to make that happen? I'm intrigued to hear from you, since you've worked and traveled in different countries.
It's Namir. No, I'm happy to lend a perspective, but I do want to. I don't like thinking about it in terms of better, right? Because better is it's so context specific, right? So it's easy for me to list countries that have very sophisticated systems, right? China is certainly one of them. I've used their biometric systems. It is extremely sophisticated. Another one, Singapore, also has a sophisticated system as well, and as does Israel. But when I'm American. I've worked for the U.S. government, and now I work for one of the largest cities in the U.S. And when I think about it's in terms of the mandate of the institutions that I serve, it really is around inclusivity, right? Like, I do think about my work as a civil servant and the platform that I have as a mode of service delivery, right? I do think about city government as one of the largest platform for delivering essential services to every single resident of all kinds. And I think what's unique about, I don't like to say unique because I think that kind of diversity is in other countries, but I can at least say even just in San Jose, right? I serve one of the largest and most diverse cities in the US. We have one of the largest Vietnamese immigrant communities, actually one of the largest Vietnamese diasporas in the world live in San Jose. I serve one of the largest Spanish-speaking communities, and a large part of of the community I serve are undocumented members, right, who live in the U.S. And so and this is Silicon Valley, and so I think that complexity is what has to be taken into consideration in policy, in the design of maybe the design of a technological solution, right? But I think oftentimes when folks don't recognize or respect that complexity, they're not able to make the best trade-off, right, between sophistication and friction. Sometimes friction exists for a reason, and and I know that's I'm speaking very hypothetical, so I'm happy to even provide a really specific example. When I think about actually verification at the local context, right? So right now, in the city of San Jose, even in the state of California, we have not rolled out digital IDs. But when I think about something as simple as making sure that low-income families, right, can benefit from childcare, right? One of the most important issues during the pandemic and after the pandemic, right? It's not uncommon for governments to essentially ask families to prove that they can benefit from this program, right? And there are many different ways you can do that. You can show a utility bill. You can show a letter showing that maybe your child qualifies for reduced school lunches, right? These are all programs that I think exist in other countries, but we struggle with whether or not that was even the right verification, right? So whether or not are we leaving families out when they were never able to access if they were never able to access those services in the first place, right? Like what I'm trying to say is that it's kind of a catch-22, right? Where it's almost like low-income families have to be able to access one service in order to access the rest, right? Or sometimes the threshold to access that one service isn't reflective of the local context, right? So a really good example of that is the federal free and reduced lunch threshold is $35,000 US dollars a year. That's the household income. But in San Jose, California, one of the wealthiest and most expensive places to live, if you're making $75,000 a year, if that's your household income, you're still considered a family in need. And so there is actually a really huge gap between even how the federal the federal threshold for need and the local threshold. And so I know this isn't necessarily about identity, but there is a component of verification, right? Because when we think about, okay, if we were to wave a magic wand and we move into the system where suddenly, you know, everybody is onto the system, it's still not solving some of the systemic issues prior to rolling out and implementing some of the system. And so I think one of the big things that I think I'm just cautioning is that it goes back to, you know, Miguel talks about, you know, it's not a technology issue. I think we need to actually solve some of the policy and operational and systemic issues around equity, around service delivery, around qualification, and around verification before we pick the technology solution.
It sounds like digital IDs are the precursors to a lot of the things that we have to resolve first before we get into that stage. But Mikhail, you know, there's a lot of discussion on the self-sovereign identity. It really goes back to the question of, as Johnny mentioned, that there has to be an interplay between government and businesses. Businesses can unlock a lot of value by having digital IDs, as much as individuals, as consumers, as citizens can benefit from having a single authentication that houses a lot of that information. The question, though, is that there is a trust factor, and there is a lot of discussion at the moment on the rise of self-sovereign identity, is that I, as an individual, should have control on what information is being shared, used or reused in different essence. What's your experience in that domain? And you know, it'd be great to hear any examples of how this is playing out in Europe.
Yeah, sure. Well, we are exploring the SSI solutions, the self-sovereign identity solutions. I believe one of the most famous companies about SSI is based in Canada, which is Everneam and the Sovereign Foundation. I believe they are based in Canada, I think, or I'm not completely sure. We've been in contact with them, but basically SSI is the promised land. Yeah, it's the promised land for the future. It's a digital initiative that recognizes an individual, that the individual should own and control their identity, their data, their credentials, without the intervening administrative or of authorities or private companies. It's about empowering citizens, allowing them to interact in the digital world with the same freedom and capacity for trust as they do in the offline world. But we have to be honest, we've done a lot of research from non-profit organizations, research companies like Gartner. We have talked with many other governments around the world. We have to be honest, this is the promised land for the future. It's not a solution for the short term. Right now, as long as I know, there is not a single successful project about SSI in the public sector. And I've been involved in many events talking about this, and so far that's a reality. That's at least what we know, and what we've been checking. Even though we believe that this is the future, because they have some standards and a very innovative interoperability model that is worth investing to learn about its potential. And that's what we're doing. We're doing several proofs of concepts and pilot to understand and to learn about this new technology, because we believe in few years, 3, 4, 5 years, Gartner says about 5 and 10 years, we believe this is going to be a very powerful technology about digital identity and about having control of your own data. But right now, it's not fully mature yet. And what we believe is the public agencies should be very pragmatic when assessing its applications. And that's our experience. Even though there is a SSI project promoted by the European community, and we are participating in that initiative. But again, this is a project for the next. It will be delivered in 3 years, so it's not a reality right now. What we have in Europe, we have, let me just point out very quickly, some successful experiences about digital identity, not using SSI, using a standard mechanism. and like Estonia, Sweden, and Belgium. And just to point out some of the key success factors of these initiatives. Basically, their electronic ID systems can be used in both the public and private sector. And in the private sector, there is a key stakeholder, which is the banking industry. So these successful examples have some similarities. They are small countries, so the governance is easy, or it's easier. And they managed to move forward because there was a strong leadership, either by government, like for instance the case of Estonia, or either by the private sector, like the bank industry in Sweden and Belgium. The key point or the issue is that it's not easy to expand this model, for instance, to Europe or to a big federal country. And actually, we have a big failure in terms of digital identity in Europe, which is called the eIDAS regulation, the electronic ID identification and signature regulation, which it was launched about 7 years ago, and it's been a complete failure. Nobody uses it. And the main reason, one of the main reasons from my point of view, I'm not an expert on that area, haven't explored that and haven't analyzed that in detail, but one of the main reasons is that it was just basically a government initiative. It was not a society initiative. So I want to point out that as it was said before, I think by joining Christine, both of them, the importance of collaboration between the public and the private sector when providing these digital identity services for the future.
Great. Johnny, I think you wanted to have a follow-up on this point.
Yeah.
So
No, thank you so much. I mean, look, I completely concur on the which is kind of some comments we started with, which is this identity has to work for people in all aspects of their lives. And so if it's a government only approach, that's not going to work in all aspects. If it's a private sector only approach, that's not going to work in all aspects. And so really having that 360-degree accessibility, it requires that collaboration and where we need to get to. And so I want to talk a couple of things about self-sovereign identity. I would say that I saw in the chats as well, Evernham as well as the Sovereign Foundation are headquartered in Utah in the US. So that's the local headquarters for that set of organizations, which is not important. But in terms of self-sovereign identity, I think that we have to think about a point that Christine made as well, which is that technology solutions are not going to they're not capable of solving social issues. And so while the newer technologies like SSI can bring more empowerment, they do have more privacy built in. There's a bit of a kind of a maybe even a libertarian streak built into that system, which is, hey, government won't be involved here. You can use this, and it will be, very open for you to make all the choices and do what you want. That won't solve that empowerment, or that kind of ecosystem won't solve the equity issues. It won't solve the inclusion issues. It certainly will be a tool, but we should just be very aware that these technologies don't have the ability to solve social problems, and we have to take them on ourselves and bring that into the solutions that come, right? So I think that's so important when we look at these new technologies. Similarly, if we looked at something like blockchain and Bitcoin, what's a driver for blockchain and Bitcoin is untraceable, anonymous, pseudo-anonymous money. Well, quite often that the issue there is, well, if you lose that money, you lose that money. You can't get it back. It's gone. And then often that space becomes very highly used by criminals because there is, they don't have the level of intervention that governments would have. So then you find yourself with something like Bitcoin or blockchain, and you have to then build in identity verification systems to meet important things like know your customer and anti-money laundering regulations. So those rules are there for reasons, good and protective reasons. And so there are going to be benefits from these newer technologies, but then it doesn't mean that we can jettison the rules of the road that we have for very good purposes. And also that knowledge that we would be protected under it's ironic, but the sovereignty of the country or the state or the place that we live, and we'll know where to go if something goes wrong there. So, and then I guess on self-sovereign identity, I think there's there is a lot of promise. And what I think I'd love the audience to think about is, try not to think about solving identity as a single solution. Try to think about it as different solutions working together. And Miguel talked about interoperability. And when we think about interoperability, we should think about bring it back to data and access to data and interoperability and policy around data. And so if we have clear policy about how we can access this data, public or private sector, and if we get that data in an interoperable format, like something like maybe the W3C standards and verifiable credentials, then what's really compelling is how we can use that data in systems like SSI or in more trusted operator networks or other kinds of systems. And so it's really how the identity space has moved over time is really about different types of ecosystem kind of working in their circles in their ecosystem. And what's new and exciting for now and where we're going is how can data be used in different systems that might be built on different technologies, including self-sovereign identity technology, and how does that data carry around with it different rules of protection? Does it carry around those rules of protection? So SSI has a lot of promise there in that sense, and I want to just contextualize it for how that can work with other technologies coming through.
Great, thank you, Johnny. So a question to all. We live in a global environment. I think looking at it from a national perspective is not going to resolve the aspect of digital ID if you and I would travel to another country, from whether it's banking information or health information or others. Any idea of how will this work out beyond our boundaries or jurisdictional boundaries? How can we enable? I mean, Europe has a whole ID card that is developing, from your passport information, insurance aspects to other factors. How can we create that sense? Because looking at it from a single jurisdiction, and even provinces, and let alone states, and increasingly globally. So, any thoughts on that? There must be some takers.
I mean, I can ice break.
Is this the role of the OECD? Is this the role of other to look into this? I would love to hear from you.
I mean, Miguel said himself, we have a passport, right? And this passport we already use and it's already trusted. If we can make that passport digital and digitally signed and digitally accepted, that is a great building block, whether it was used in SSI or any kind of system. So getting that passport credential into an interoperable data format is a really important start. Yeah. Sorry, Miguel, go for it.
No, it shouldn't be that complicated. I mean, we have managed to get a standard on paper or in plastic. Why we cannot do it on our mobile telephone? So it shouldn't be that complicated. The key issue is about digital onboarding, about how you prove who you are from remote. And again, here we have really good experiences in the banking industry. We are implementing those in Catalonia and many other areas in Europe, using all these artificial intelligence, using facial recognition, facial documents, proof of life algorithms, and so on. So now we have a really good, powerful digital onboarding on knowing your customer technologies that can allow anybody from around the world to have to get a digital identity. Right now, if you wish, any of you can request a digital identity from Catalonia right now using this technology, just showing your password, and so that is very powerful. When you have this enrollment done, after that, we have several authentications mechanisms which are very well proven. So that's the easy part. The complicated part is match your identity. Basically, what we do is match it with your mobile phone, which is a very personal device. And actually, the mobile phone actually is a very inclusion key factor, because we have a lot of data that most of people, except the elders people, have a mobile phone. So if we match a digital identity, with your mobile, that's a very successful initiative. Let me just say one thing before to say sorry about the location of Sovereign and Evernym. I was confused, as it was said by some people who are attending. I was confused because one of the first public initiatives of SSI, of Evernym and Sovereign was implemented in British Columbia and Ontario, and I got confused because I talked to these guys in Canada and Evernym at the same time. Sorry for that.
Okay, so another question, actually, before we go to the audience on that, is that are we doing sufficient awareness on this issue? I think there is, digital IDs have been in discussion, but within certain forums in the know on this subject. This is a matter of great interest from a societal, from a democratic, from unleashing economic benefits. How do we unleash this? How do we make this much more visible, this discussion?
Yeah, I'm happy to weigh in here. I do agree that digital IDs as a topic is right now currently concentrated in circles who read McKinsey white papers, quite frankly, and yet it could if rolled out successfully or implemented, it's a platform. This is going to be the same way where I talk about how government's a platform for service delivery. I think digital IDs is really a technological platform for gatekeeping services. This is a big deal. And I think that's actually the way to frame it when it comes to raising awareness, when it comes to getting buy-in, and when it comes to actually getting some of the feedback, right? Getting some of the really important user feedback, like Mikkel said, right? And helping folks understand, the why behind the adoption. They're not going to, I don't know if the conversation with constituents will necessarily be around the technology, but I think it will be around what is it going to be used for? What will it prevent me from accessing, right? And I want to frame it in terms of, not just in terms of digital rights, but now just, at least in the US, right? We think about rights in relation to the Constitution. And, Joni, you brought up some really great examples, even about just COVID passports and the vaccine. I mean, at least in the US, I mean, we have the 14th Amendment, which ensures equal protection under the law, but we have also had Supreme Court cases like Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which talks about, which actually upholds the state's ability to enforce vaccination laws. That being said, I am part of a country where there are communities who will not be vaccinated, and they do not necessarily have to be, right? And so even an example like talking about a COVID passport, a digital COVID passport, or any COVID passport in relation to ID, in relation to it being a gatekeeping mechanism, it's so much more than just, again, it's more than the technology, right? I think I see the pushback less around the technology and more about understanding how this is going to be enforced and who will be enforcing it.
Okay, thank you. I think we're coming to the top of the hour. In fact, this time flies on this. Maybe a last question, if somebody can provide a 30-second response on that. Any countries are integrating digital IDs into their vaccine passport strategy? Are you aware of any of that? I think that's a question from the audience that came on this.
There are some initiatives in Europe, but they are managed by the health departments. So I'm not directly involved in any of them. But again, that is a really good example for a SSI solution, a self-sovereign solution, because it's basically the vaccine passport is just a credential. The funny thing is that Europe, for instance, has decided not to use SSI technologies and blockchain for that. And the thing is, it's because it's a very innovative technology, but it's not mature yet, and they didn't want to take the risk about that. So they are going for a more standard way, which is basically a QR code and things like that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks, Miguel. Listen, I think this debate can take another hour of discussion, a lot of thoughts on that. I think what's the main thematics that came out of this discussion today is that digital ID is not a technology, it's a precursor to many of the issues that we have to resolve from a societal, economic, collaboration aspect that we have to implement first to make this take place. And there's obviously the awareness aspect, there's inter-jurisdictional aspects that we have to resolve, the giving the individual more of the self-sovereignty to manage their identity going forward. And I think the debate will continue on this matter. Listen, this discussion has been a prelude to a larger summit, Digital Future Summit, that we're organizing in the next couple of months. You'll hear more about it in the official announcement. But I'd like to sincerely thank all the panelists for all the incredible thoughts. I've certainly learned a lot from the discussion today on this subject, and would love to keep the dialogue going in the future on this initiative. So thank you again, and thank you to the audience for participating in this discussion, and look forward to future debates on this matter. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks.